Hey there guys and gals, welcome to the second My Two Cents. This one's going to be for Between Me and the Night. This is an interesting game in that they actually start the game with the credits, which is pretty cool. But first of all, this game is, it's technically classified as a point and click. Though, I mean, it has other elements in it, and there's different kinds of game modes. But for the most part, most people would fit this into point and click adventure type territory. And that's not really a genre that I'm all that comfortable with, / that I ever have really played. So this game took quite a while for me to get used to. And I want to put out a big thank you to Raindance and whoever their liaison with Keymailer is, because they were the first. This is the first key I ever got as part of Keymailer, and like that it just made me so happy and proud and what have you. So I want to say a big thank you to you guys, first of all. Now, I got the key before the game actually released, and I had played through the entire thing, and I had the footage right, and then I went to edit it and realized I couldn't, had to re-render it, and then the game released, and I was like, uh-oh. So I was originally going to make it an On the Hunt, and then the game released, and instead, here's the full game. So I'm going to give you guys my impressions and what have you. Not so much a review, but how I feel about the game, and hopefully this will help influence you on whether or not you want to buy it. So when you start the game, you end up in this tutorial, which teaches you about the real world. There's 4 worlds within the game that you'll run into. There's the real world, which is this tutorial. Well, this tutorial teaches you how to manage things in the real world with the mouse and keyboard. Then there's the Dark Souls world, which is what really originally intrigued me about the game. And then there's a generic Knight world and the Shovel Knight homage world. And this tutorial teaches you the commands and what have you, but one thing it does not explain to you is that there's actually another key. And the only reason I found it is because I went to the options menu and I configured keys just to make sure I knew where everything was. And the key that's missing is shift. And left shift by default lets you run, which I just did there. And without being able to run, the game is incredibly difficult, and that's something I feel like they need to add to the tutorial. They don't even add it to the Dark Souls Worlds tutorial, which has a slightly different tutorial than the one we just did. And because of that, makes the game a lot harder. So I think when you make your tutorial, if there's buttons that players really need to know, I think you should really include them. Now, speaking of the other worlds, why don't we take a look at one of them? The first world, besides the real world that you enter, is the generic Knight world. And there's no tutorial for this, but it makes the game into more of a platformer. And while the controls are totally fine in the real world, in the platformer worlds, the controls are a little, I don't know how to explain them. Like, you have too much control. There's different variations of jump based on how much pressure you apply to the spacebar, but you can control the complete, like, aerial escapades of the character. Like, you can jump straight up and then move. You can jump and move in all different variations, and you can like just turn around and keep going. So it makes the jumping a little bit weird and kind of like sticky and hard to deal with. But the generic Knight world, it's not so much of a problem. In the Shovel Knight homage world, it becomes very, very hard, especially because you're on a timer. But like the ladders in the generic Knight world, you end up getting stuck on them a lot. There was a glitch in early access that happened to me a lot. Like, I just got stuck in the wall just now. Happened to me a lot on that bottom bridge, where the bottom bridge would spawn, and if I was touching the area it spawned in, I would just get stuck there until something hit me and killed me. And it seems like they fixed that for the full game, but then they added a bunch more issues. What with you getting stuck in the actual walls and what have you. So the controls for the platform sections where you need them to be really precise are really imprecise, which is kind of annoying. But I will say, the game keeps getting harder and harder. I don't actually know what the max level you can get to is, but it just gets harder and harder, which I think is really interesting, because in early access it was like, oh, there's nothing special about this. It's like you just do it once. And this is the only time you're going to enter the generic night world. It's anytime you touch the, I'm going to guess it's an NES as opposed to an SNES. When you join the Shovel Knight world, you jump into a GBA, and when you go into Dark Souls world, it's an arcade cabinet. Now, let's take a look at the third world, which is the Dark Souls world, I like to call it. There's a tutorial for this world as well, so it's there, but again, they leave out the shift key. And while the shift key isn't as necessary as it may be for you later in the real world, the shift key is still pretty darn useful. In the Dark Souls world, the shift key actually lets you dodge roll, which really helps you, especially at catching people. But one thing I've noticed that I don't think they had in the early access version, what I want to say about the early access version is that it's the first early access game I've ever played that had a beginning, middle, and end. Like, the game was complete. It was what you'd call first pass, though, in that it was complete, but there were still like little things here and there that they had to work on. Like some sound effects were missing. Entire sections of the game had no music. Like in the early access version of the game, the entire last sequence of the game had no sound at all, and it was the most eerie thing I've ever done in my life. But I want to say the fact that the enemies that you can kill have some kind of visible health system, I think is very, very useful. Like in the Dark Souls world, when you lock on with spacebar, there's a Sims-like cursor above the enemy that you're locked onto's head, and that tells you their health depending on what color it is. So that's very useful. And I don't want to show you footage of the only boss in the game that I could find, unless there's a mini boss somewhere. But it has visible health as well, and if you don't know how to run, it's going to be extremely difficult to defeat the boss. Like, I beat the boss without knowing how to run, and it took me at least 10-15 tries. Just remember this when you fight the first boss, well, the only boss. Remember conventions of general gaming, in that red is bad and blue is okay. Just keep that in mind. Now, what you just saw is my major gripe with Dark Souls mode. In that when your characters are really, really, really close to one another, there's no hitbox, there's no connection. So you both just swing at nothing. And I noticed in Brawlhalla that's something that happens really often, but in Dark Souls mode here too, it's really infuriating that you're swinging so wildly and your enemy's swinging so wildly and nothing happens. Now, another weird thing about this is the running animations are kind of weird when you're in the real world and Dark Souls world. And when you're in the Dark Souls world especially, you're gonna run into a glitch. It's gonna happen at least once, where you're trying to walk upstairs or downstairs and you get stuck, but your character will play the animation of you walking, even if it's in place. And then you'll get stuck and you'll be like, what's going on? And then you have to walk up or down and make him do the animations of you as though you were walking down the stairs, even though your character's not moving. And that's kind of difficult to figure out. I don't want to show you guys the Shovel Knight homage world because it's entirely optional, and I feel like you should find it on your own. So I'm not going to talk too much about that. But the jumping, because you have so much control in the jumping in that mode, and it's one-hit kills if you touch any spikes or monsters, and you have to start again, that makes it a little more difficult. So it's kind of got like, I've never actually played Shovel Knight, but I've heard it's difficult. I've played Meat Boy. I'm gonna say it's probably in that ballpark, except that it's a really short romp through Shovel Knight's world. Another thing about this game is there's no spoken dialogue at all. So while you have to read things, it also has sort of a Dark Soulsy feel, wherein things aren't explicitly explained to you, but you kind of get the gist of what's going on from all the dialogue, from what little dialogue occurs. And one thing I've noticed between early access and now is that it seems like the entire game is brighter, which really, really, really helps, especially in the house and investigation mode. I know a lot of people who play point-and-click adventures and what have you, just adventure games in general, hate the fact that like when you look, when you inspect things, the stuff that you're supposed to pick up glows. And one thing Between Me and the Night does very well is that there are tons of things in the environment that you can pick up and inspect and learn a little bit about. But I'm used to games, even if there's a few things, you usually have a guess as to what is important or not. But in Between Me and the Night, you can pick up a lot of things in the environment that are not important to the story or the gameplay at all, and you just pick them up and carry them around. And one thing that really upset me about early access version was that there were things that you could tell they were building to make achievements out of, or mini games or what have you, but they weren't all implemented yet. So you could find tons of extra stuff in the environment, but it wasn't the stuff you needed. And that drove me insane. So I'm happy to see that now the achievements are open and what have you. It's easier to grab items and actually bring them where they need to go, because that is very important. Now let's talk about puzzles, because what would a game like this be without puzzles? Some of the puzzles in this game are real head scratchers, but not always for the reason that you think. One of the puzzles involves grabbing really tiny objects, and I've noticed that even though the game is a lot brighter now, tiny objects like the hands of a clock or keys sometimes get wrapped up in the background. Like, even though they're in the foreground, you really just think they're part of the background and you don't notice them. Or you walk right past them a million times like I did in early access. It's so much easier when you actually know where you're going. But one of the puzzles in early access actually is the science lab puzzle. And in early access, they hadn't had the notes implemented yet that you needed to figure it out, or I didn't know where they were and couldn't find them. And I actually had to Google how to fix this puzzle. But it wasn't like I Googled Between Me and the Night puzzle. I Googled how to do it in real life. And I feel like I had a bad high school experience because I did not understand this, and I never had a chance to do that. Exactly what you have to do to finish this puzzle. But there's one thing that Rain Dance does exceptionally well, and that's enemy placement. Like, there's a lot of things in the world I mentioned before there's so many things in the world of Between Me and the Night that you can pick up that are items that aren't necessarily related to the story or aren't necessarily related to something that you actually need to complete a quest. But all the enemies in the game, except for one, are placed exactly in the right spot. In the real world, but because you're not a fighter, it's not like the Dark Souls world, you don't have a sword and shield, if you see an enemy, you generally have to avoid it, and that keeps you on the correct path. Though I will say, like, in early access, a lot of the things weren't implemented yet, so like the ways to get all of the achievements and what have you weren't all the way implemented in. But now that they are, because of enemy placement in the real world, it might be hard to complete some of the achievements, like finding all the army men and what have you, because there are enemies in the way now. There were a lot less enemies in early access. But in the Dark Souls world, the enemies will always lead you to exactly where you need to go. When you need to figure out what things are destructible in the environment, the enemies in the Dark Souls world will actually run straight towards those items in the environment, so that you hit the enemies as well as those items that you need to break, so you learn how to deal with them. And I think that is such a good mark of game design, especially as a contrast to all the red herrings of items that you find in the real world. But in the Dark Souls world, you know exactly where to go 100% of the time. My major gripe with the game, though, is the length. It clocks in at just about under an hour, and that's when you're doing extra things. And in a game like this, you really start to feel for the character, commiserate with them, and then they're gone, and the experience is over. And I think that's a major drawback to the game. Also, the fact that it's $14.99 but only an hour long, I know that's kind of steep for a lot of people, especially because there's not really that much replay value, except to get the achievements and what have you. But I mean, when you replay this game, since it's only an hour long, it's really like, oh, I'm going to get this, I'll run back into the game and do it. So it's not like there's anything like amazingly difficult about replaying it. And the other problem I have with it is the ending is so anticlimactic compared to you fight the only boss that I found in the game right in the middle of the game. So you think when you get to the end there's going to be a boss, but there's not. And I think that's a drawback. But for what this game is and what this team has done, minus the stairs, because stairs are always a problem in this game, I think that it was really worth it. And I just want to say thank you to Raindance and whoever their liaison with Keymailer is for taking a chance on me. So, I'll see you guys again soon. Actually, I have the entire Let's Play of the game commentary list, so if you guys want me to put that in, leave a comment below and tell me if you want me to upload it or not. So until then, I'll see you guys later. Bye!